real enough. Other rappers is delirious. Yeah, it's really that serious. Better holler if you really feeling me. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna live in abundance. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna. I gotta keep it 100. We gotta stop all the stunting. You know we coming from nothing. Yo, you talking about money, you bluffing. We gotta do something different. We gotta change how we live in. We gotta do better for women. We gotta do better for children. We gotta listen to victims, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian. It doesn't matter your religion. You gotta stand against the system, or else you just another villain. How you just sitting there chilling?
My name is Jamar Jabari, and we are back again for another episode of Jabari Vlog Podcast, keeping it music, politics, and culture at all times. And today we have another special guest, Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, who is a Latin studies Latin politics studies expert. I'm going to read his bio real quick for everyone. And I apologize for my lag. It is my lag. Dr. Rodrigo Acuña is a teacher, writer, and expert on Latin American politics. He has a Bachelor's of Arts in Politics and International Relations in Spanish and Latin American Studies from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, as well as a diploma in education from the same institution. In 2013, he completed a PhD on Venezuelan foreign policy after having been awarded an Australian Postgraduate Award by the federal government. Without further ado, everyone, Dr. Rodrigo Acuña.
Thank you very much, Samar, for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come on, my friend. I wanted to definitely have you on to talk about what's going on in Latin America currently right now. There's a lot of discussion on it, which is why it's such a huge deal to continue this conversation. And again, I want to thank you so much for having the time to come back on. To come on. You also have a podcast, by the way. Can you shout that out?
Certainly. So I host a podcast with Alborada, which is a UK-based online magazine / forum. It's a multimedia sort of outlet, and it focuses on Latin America. And they have two podcasts, and one of them is called Indestructible Latin America with Rodrigo Acuña. It's a monthly podcast, so if people Google my name, Indestructible Podcast, Alborada's at Alborada, they'll be able to find the podcast. And it's a podcast on Latin American politics, a monthly podcast. I interview experts on the region.
Thank you so much. And definitely I'll have that in the link below for everyone to check out when it's up. And so I think it's very important from especially American perspective, non-Latin the descent Americans, they don't really have a understanding unless they actually look and study what's going on. A lot of people are still thinking that the Mexicans are the only people that come from Latin America, and they try to hop the border all the time. That's literally the racist rhetoric that I see a lot. But this is why we have these discussions on here, and for people to see, to break those the racial boundaries and that racist rhetoric that has been part of the culture of American history, as seeing people outside of America as other instead of seeing them as individual sovereign nations, and this is not the best country in the world, all that hoopla. But one thing that's very important that shocked me, Brazil has always been the I would say they're kind of similar in a way with our culture, politically, but then they're not at all. I know about the dictatorship and everything, but just like seeing how they had a coup, like how we had a coup with just not being a real coup in a way, is just right wingers just getting insane about that. What freaked me out that made me expect something different, and I don't have the intelligence that I want to know, is just the reaction of how Biden actually was supportive of Lula, um, and how Ocasio Cortez was actually supportive of Lula as well too, where Ocasio Cortez has also a history, like the Democratic Party, to be supportive of the fascist regimes that take over government and all this stuff like that. Did that shock you?
No, it didn't. It didn't shock me because historically there is a consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans regarding U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. It's only when you have full right-wing fascist military regimes in power, like Pinochet in Chile during the Cold War, the Videla in Argentina in the 1970s and into the early 80s, that's when things become really embarrassing for the Democrats. And that's when some of them will speak out and say, we should be supporting human rights in Latin America, or they are going a little bit too far. There are exceptions. There have been politicians that have genuinely lobbied in Congress to stop, for example, the sale of arms, or again making statements supporting various declarations by Amnesty International, etc., etc. But as a broad whole, there is a consensus between these two political parties. Latin America is not a region which needs to really be studied in an in-depth manner. It's not a region that you really want to have the New York Times or the mainstream media accurately reporting on, because if that were the situation, I think a lot of people in the United States would be absolutely outraged in terms of what's happening in Latin America in their name, and how their tax dollars are being used quite inappropriately. So yes, Brazil is a very good example. You have a right-wing you had a very right-wing administration that tried to hold on to power. It tried to carry out a soft coup like Trump did, basically steal the elections. And they sort of modeled themselves in a similar manner to Trump, it's almost hilarious, because Latin America, if there's one thing that the military knows how to do in Latin America, it's to actually carry out a proper coup d'etat. And what Trump tried to do was not a proper coup d'etat. If it was a proper coup d'etat, he would still be in power now. And a lot of people will be rounded up and would be in concentration camps right now. So it's almost hilarious that the admiration that the elites in Latin America have for the United States has now translated into sort of following the United States alt-right as well. So things are getting really bizarre.
Yeah, I like how you point that out in such a way, because I feel like I wasn't able to articulate it to people that way, because it's literally what I was trying to explain. It is an embarrassment, and it's honestly showing just how weak U.S. hegemony is right now. Because in the past, they probably would have had supported arms for this coup to happen. But I mean, Bolsonaro as well, even though that he was very there's a lot of horrible things I'm reading, investigations of what he has done, and it's just an eye-opener to a lot of people as well too, I think. He also stayed with the BRICS nation, with BRICS. I said BRICS nation, with BRICS. With people that don't understand BRICS is like a comparable G7 between China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, and India, right? I believe it's India as well too. Yes, correct. In India. So he stayed there with them, even though that was against the right-wing policy here in America. And that's a benefit that now Lula can use. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I was going to say, I mean, Bolsonaro had to. Once one of the things about international trade agreements is that once they are signed, they are very hard to get out of. It's not easy. It's not something that can be easily untangled. So
Gotcha.
historically, the majority of Latin American countries have actually exported primary resources to the United States. And that's the relationship that US multinationals absolutely love. They love it when they're getting all the fruits and the vegetables that they can, the best stuff from Central America. They love it when they're getting the lithium from Peru and Bolivia, the copper from Chile, the rubber from Brazil. The list just goes on and on. What they don't like is when South American, Latin American countries begin to A, trade with each other, or B, begin to trade with countries that, yes, there are things that are questionable and should be questioned. But in terms of trade relations, it's actually beneficial for Latin American countries to have trade with China, with India, and to basically have a diversity of trade. And that really upsets the United States. I mean, if the Washington establishment and the stock traders in New York. So that's something that Bolsonaro, he would have loved to have, I think, withdrawn Brazil from BRICS, but it's an agreement that was locked in, and it's a sort of a growing trend in many parts of the world, that the very fact that China now can use its economic and diplomatic muscle, the same thing with the Russians, it just provides an alternative. So it doesn't mean that Latin American countries don't want to trade with the United States. The majority is still quite happy to trade, but it's the long critique that has been made by people on the sort of progressive / left / radical side of politics is that those trade agreements are fundamentally they are incredibly unfair. They're not fair to the people in Latin America, and certainly people in the United States themselves. The average person in the US is not benefiting from it. It's benefiting the local elites in Latin America, and it's benefiting the stock traders at the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah. And the reason why I brought that up, because I see now that maybe because there hasn't been like really any motion with them, but I see now they're talking about it now with Lula, and there's just a lot that Lula has to do just for Brazil alone before even just get into stock trades. And then he has to worry about what is the US actual intentions as well too while he is in power, which honestly that's very stressful within itself. So what I'm getting to with Lula is that what do you think, for instance, he can get across? I know that he's very gifted with trying to balance different circumstances between countries and build relationships with these countries that are problematic, like imperialist, the United States of America. But can he actually like if I think what scares me is that if he does what he tried to do his last term with keeping the poverty rate lower and everything, would this trigger the United States? I think that's exactly what. It's confusing, but I'm literally just worried about Lula as president.
I think I know. Yeah, I think I know where you're trying to get at. I mean,
right.
Lula domestically did a lot of good things when he was in power, and the same thing with Dilma. This is a broad-based. It's called the Workers' Party of Brazil,
and that was his vice president at the time, right?
Correct. And Dilma Rousseff, and then she eventually became the president. Now, it's called the Workers' Party for a reason, and the reason is that it is actually a broad working class political party. For all of its faults and allegations, and there even were certainly there were cases of corruption when they were in power, but the poverty rates came down. Legislation to protect the Amazon was enacted. Under Bolsonaro, the Amazon was just opened up for logging industries. For it basically became the Wild West. You had footage of images of indigenous communities running from their villages, and the villages were being burnt down by loggers. I mean, just really atrocious,
horrific
things were horrific taking place. So Lula is definitely a force for good for working class people in Brazil. The problem is that Lula yes, the United States is a power, but it can't. Because Brazil is large enough that it can stand up to some extent to the United States. The problem then becomes, how far can Lula push things within Brazil without triggering the military, without triggering
right. That was my question. There we go.
Yeah, the whole sort of onslaught from the business community. And in the past, he has found that balance. But for people that observe the region, or are trying to constantly observe the region in an in-depth manner, like myself, we're looking and we're trying to analyze. I mean, again, how far progressive policies can be pushed without triggering a military coup. Now, I think the big problem is that when that does occur, if we do get to a point where there is a coup in two key countries, because the other countries, yes, they have their own, they are important, but the big regional players in South America are Argentina and Brazil. And if a right-wing fascist coup takes place and there's a military regime in any of those countries, then it's going to have a domino effect. Then they're going to support the fascist right in Colombia. They're going to support the fascist right in Chile. And that's when a lot of these other center-left, progressive, leftist governments are going to start falling down or are going to be in serious danger. So it remains to be seen, how far Lula will try and push things and how much he will be allowed to get away with domestically.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess that's just honestly the best way we can take it for right now. And I really wish the best for the people of Brazil, and I wish the best for the working class of Brazil and Lula, because this is literally a breath of fresh air after everything I've been hearing that's been going on there, especially after COVID and this whole investigation with the genocidal Bolsonaro who's hiding right now in Florida. Florida is so horrible with just letting these people come in and stuff like that. But
it's a haven for the Latin American right, unfortunately. They have a long history of being there in Florida and Miami.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's just, I see the video sometimes where like they are literally just a huge Republican like front, like over there. It's just serious. And I've never seen it that way. Like, because I'm up here up north, it's not really that. It's usually just white people, but
and there are a lot of former military personnel, Latin American military personnel that are wanted in numerous Latin American countries for serious human rights violations, and they live in Florida. And they've been given sort of the green light to stay there by either the FBI or the US State Department, et cetera, because many of them in the past were working for military regimes that the United States supported.
Wow. That's interesting. And then speaking of regimes and coups and all this stuff, Peru, we last time I spoke with Ortiz, great guy, and it was just very grim what we heard so far. Is there any updates for the people of Peru?
Well, there's been the number of deaths that have occurred have increased. So I think we're now up to about 60 or just over 60 protesters that have been killed by state authorities. Repression still continues. It's now over 20 plus days of a national strike. I mean, imagine when a national strike in countries like the United States and even here in Australia, where the union movement is still quite weak, the concept of a national strike it almost has to be explained. So what a national strike means is that the key sort of federation of all the trade unions in the country say we're not going to work until this government resigns or makes serious concessions on point A, B, C, D. So basically the whole country stops, or the majority of the country stops. Now, this has been happening in Peru for over 20 days. The country is at a standstill. You have tourists that can't get out of places like Machu Picchu. Peru has a massive tourism industry. That's right. And you have people from all over the world that are stuck in Machu Picchu and in other parts of Peru. airports have been taken over. So the country is in serious turmoil. So now I think it's becoming a sort of a showdown between the protest movement that would like for Peru to have a new constitution. They would like for the president the center left president that was arrested. They would like to see him released, and the government is not budging. So we will see whether the government decides to eventually use the military, put them on the streets and increase the repression, and then we'll be talking maybe of hundreds of people being killed, or the government decides to resign. So we're now at a complete, almost a showdown between people power and a US-backed stooge regime in Latin America, which has almost zero credibility within Peru and throughout the region with other Latin American countries. And Boluarte, the head of this regime, she fundamentally doesn't care as long as the Biden administration backs her, and they gave her something like $8 million a couple of days after the coup for coca eradication program. They always create these fancy titles, but as long as she's getting support from Washington, as long as they're getting support from Washington, they couldn't give two hoots about what the rest of the region thinks.
Wow. Yeah. So will you call this the beginning of a revolution in a way?
Well, this is the interesting thing. If you go into Peruvian history, in the 1970s, there was a military leader who was in many ways quite revolutionary. He saw himself on the progressive side of politics. He carried out a large land reform program. The majority of the military leaders in Latin America have been from the political right and even the ultra right, but there have been some very small but yet important exceptions. And the military leader in Peru in the 1970s was one of them, and that is a situation which is again being closely watched. So there was. I think a lieutenant or a colonel who made a statement saying that he did not support the current regime in Peru, and I think that the Peruvian military intelligence and all the sort of the US advisors, etc., they would be watching and screening. So we could wake up tomorrow or in a week's time and find out that a section of the Peruvian military has decided to stand up and ally themselves with the people. And yes, I mean, things are really very, they're quite turbulent at the moment, and they could swing either way. We could have the military come onto the streets and just start massacring people, or we could see a division within the armed forces. I think it's not something which I would say is highly likely, but I wouldn't discard it, again, given the history of progressive and nationalist leaders inside the Peruvian military.
Yeah, and I want to voice that for people listening, that Juan Castillo had the right to abolish that parliament. I call it parliament, but what do they call it?
Correct. The Peruvian Congress.
Yes. Yeah, he had the right under that constitution, because dictators have used that in the past, and he's not a dictator. He's a leftist, and their Congress has done everything in throughout his term to try to stop him from having so much powers, and they only want to do that.
Yeah, it wasn't really about him having powers. It was about him being able to carry out policies, enact policies which were going to fulfill the promises that he made. He promised that he was going to carry out deep structural reforms, because Peru is a country that has so many minerals. It is such a vastly rich country, and yet you have shocking levels of poverty, which should be viewed as completely unacceptable. So that's what he tried to do, and that right-wing Congress consistently sabotaged his government to the point that he said, okay, well, I'm going to temporarily abolish Congress, call for new elections, and then he was arrested within the same day, and then we had this soft coup, and now we're at where we are at.
Right. And my last question on Peru, because considering the pink wave that has happened, for viewers that are listening, the pink wave I'm meaning as in a resurgence of a pink wave of leftist uh, uh, presidents being elected in Colombia, in Honduras, all over. There's the left is winning. A good friend of mine by the name of Sakara Libre, they said that Latin America has had their time with neoliberalism and they are done with neoliberalism. So, are we seeing this as an important win for neoliberalism with Peru? Could this be like a priority secretly for the United States to try to get a foothold back into Latin America?
The United States is going to diplomatically and economically support any government which is or any political figure which is going to restore the status quo. So if there is a coup tomorrow in Chile, I don't think there will be, but let's just say hypothetically there was, I would almost bet the house that the Biden administration would recognize that regime. Again, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats in the US, they are more than happy to have relations, economic relations, political relations with military regimes or ultra right-wing regimes in Latin America. The most important thing is that those business deals are not restructured. The most important thing is that you don't have a government that comes into power and says, we're happy for your oil companies to keep working in within our borders, but we are going to increase the taxes that they pay by, and we're not talking radical numbers here, 5%. I mean, that's enough for the US to start looking for political players to try and carry out a coup. So what's happening in Peru is a win for the political right in Latin America, and it's certainly a win for the United States. Diplomatically, the US may say, yes, we welcome the Lula victory in Brazil, but at the same time, Bolsonaro is walking around, in the streets of Miami. The contradictions with the Democrats are just, as you would, I'm sure, quite well know, are enormous.
Definitely. And briefly, because Mexico, they had their three amigos, which is, oh my god, I can't believe they called it that, but whatever. They had their little three amigos conference, and the Mexican president, he gave out some good, valid harshness, but I feel like he should have been little bit more harsher. But I get it. You can't go all the way in. I understand that. I gotta give him respect for that. But there is what he's talking about with the guns situation in Mexico, and no one knows where those guns are coming from, and the issue with the cartels and stuff like that. Like, no one really understands what are the problems that Mexicans are dealing with in their country. It's always people in the United States just complaining about immigration, people in Europe just complaining about immigration, and they don't get exactly why are people coming here. Like, I speak to a lot of immigrants all the time, because here in New Haven we're very diverse, and I have a lot of friends that are immigrants that I can call friends, so thankfully, and they don't, a lot of them talk about, who are on the left, talk about, I would like to go back, and this notion that people think that they want to just stay here because this is the greatest country in the world. No. And so, like, this is why we have to talk about what's going on in Mexico, and understand more on this issue, instead of just, they just keep coming here. Like, the right is just keep bringing that up, pushing it. Like, we don't need funding for Ukraine. We need funding for the borders. For what? What do you need to fund? To shoot them? Like, I don't understand that.
Yeah. What they want funding for is the US industrial military complex. That's what they always want funding for, and they will systematically lie to the public in the United States so they can get that funding, so then their stockholders can make more money. In the case of Mexico, for example, in Mexico, the country actually has very strict gun laws. Mexico doesn't have a weapons industry per se, or that's large enough to be able to sell handguns and submachine guns and automatic and semi-automatic weapons to the Mexican population. The weapons come from the United States. That's well known. There's plenty of evidence of that. The
Mm.
weapons are smuggled into Mexico from the United States, and because of the explosion of the drug trade and the cartels, then comes, of course, the violence. So any talk about the violence in Mexico and the cartels, if a government in the United States were serious about that, they would do two things, in my opinion. Number one, they'd actually have some serious gun control laws. You don't need a weapon that's for warfare to go hunting. That's ridiculous. You guys are like on planet Mars on that issue. Like, the majority of the developed world is actually quite sensible. You can't have the vast majority of the population having access to those kinds of weapons. One day you're fine, the next day you have an emotional crisis and you decide to, shoot up whoever, whatever, and that's a problem. You can't have that. Now, the other thing is the trade agreements. To get back to the issue of within the US and Mexico, the US should invest in reform programs for drug addicts. So you reduce the amount of people within the US that are consuming drugs, and the people and the whole trade within Mexico and Latin America will decrease, because the biggest purchasers of cocaine, marijuana, hashish, etc., is the United States. So tackle those issues and you will see huge changes. Now, in terms of migration, this complaint about they're coming through our borders, they're taking our jobs, etc. Well, when the NAFTA free trade agreement was enacted in 1994, the US talked about, the propaganda apparatus that was put in place, talked about this was a trade agreement that was going to benefit Mexico, it was going to benefit the United States, and it was going to benefit Canada. Rubbish, absolute rubbish. Who it benefited, again, were the stock traders, were the large, the business community, the large business community. They dismantled the car industry within the United States. They shipped it over to Mexico. They rebuilt it in Mexico. But in Mexico, because that country had a long tradition of trade unions, they started hiring females. So you have a large female workforce that works in Mexico that is non-unionized. They are almost systematically abused.
Oh, wow.
They build 70% of the vehicles in Mexico, whatever. Then they move them over to the US. They put the last chips in, and then that's trade. That's not trade. That's just a dodgy way to say that you are trading between the two countries. You're just assembling a car in two different parts of the world, and they're literally right next to each other. You have a situation as well, just to give you one more example, where the Mexican the countryside was flooded by cheap US corn, by excess stock of corn. So it destroyed the local corn industry in Mexico. So Mexico now has to import corn from the United States. Does that benefit the average farmer in the US? Well, probably not. It probably benefits, again, big agribusiness inside the United States. So all these free trade agreements should generally be viewed as, who do they fundamentally benefit? Do they benefit the average working class person in the United States? Do they benefit the average peasant and working class person in Mexico or in Canada? And almost every single time you will come up with a very firm and definitive no.
Yeah. I mean, that, like, we don't really have the time to talk about trade and how it goes, really. But that is literally a discussion that could go on for hours and hours, people, and you will be just so shocked about it, and how much they try to just put other countries like China into the mix of it, just to get you to like not realize what's really going on. There's a lot. You literally just gave like a hint of how it's so bad with this shit in Mexico. But I don't want to take up more of your time. So lastly, you're located in Sydney, Australia.
Correct. Correct.
And in Australia, they just had a what they call Australia Day, but Indigenous people call it Invasion Day. Can you just give like a brief history on why there's a difference between the two for Americans here?
certainly. So, I'll make my comments, but I generally don't like to talk about areas outside of my area of expertise. But yes, I have been living here for a very long time, so I do know what the arguments are and the context. So, Australia Day is technically the day that the British first arrived to survey this country. They were on their way, I think, to it was a sort of a pit stop that they did. I mean, going back 200 and so years ago, we didn't have GPS. They couldn't say, oh, we're going to get from point A to point B, and they knew exactly where they were going. But that date, January 26, marked then what became the invasion of Australia by the British Empire. If you read some of the Australian historians, they will get into it wasn't that exact date, etc., etc., and they're probably right. However, that date has become the date that the Australian establishment has viewed as the day that should be viewed as the day that the nation was created. The British, when they arrived, they declared this place terra nullius, which is a Latin term that means an empty land, or it's a land that no one inhabits. And of course, you had the indigenous peoples, in this country that had been here for 40, maybe even 60,000 years. So there has been a cultural push and a political push by the progressives within Australian politics to change the date. That date is a date that is really a date which was, it's associated with British imperialism, and yes, now they're trying to, they've said it's the foundation of the country, but the country is actually much longer. So why would it be too difficult to change the date and pick another date and then say, well, let's recognize that this country is not just now a country that has British, Scottish, Irish heritage. It's a country that has indigenous heritage. It has people from all over the world. You come to cities like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, you'll find people from all over the world. There's a long history of Chinese migration in this country, which many people aren't aware of. So that's something that it needs to become viewed as a melting pot. Now, Australia, just to give you a sort of a context to the United States, I mean, there was an article of many years ago said it called Australia the land that time forgot, and it sort of is, because it has been changing. But if you view the sort of mainstream television, you're still going to be viewing the majority of the host of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon heritage. Basically, it's like viewing US television in the 1970s and 60s and 50s, and it's just all white faces. It's just all white guys and white girls that you're seeing on TV. And then you walk on the streets of Los Angeles, New York, etc., etc., and it's totally different. So Australia, some people will have the opinion of racism. I don't know if you could the most racist, but it's certainly a country that has an issue with race, and that white sort of hegemony has been propped up by the traditional establishment, which is an integral part of that establishment is the Murdoch media. Rupert Murdoch begun. He is Australian, and he commenced his empire here in Australia, and it's an extremely conservative or to the far right or to the right media establishment. And so for them to make that concession and say, well, actually, let's at least have a discussion, put it up for a referendum, should we change the date or not? They're not even going to enter into that discussion because they see it as offensive. The Australian establishment, the elite, the business community, they have that those links to England, and then now because of the structure of the world, to the United States, and so in summary, they would very much like to keep it a white world, so to speak. And part of that world is not conceding that there was eventually an invasion, there was a conquest in this country, like in other parts of the world, and that horrific massacres took place, and numerous peoples and cultures were completely destroyed. And that's very uncomfortable for certain Australians to admit that and have a sensible discussion about that.
Wow. And this just goes to understand a lot of my closing point, people listening, that there is a lot of history, and the history is like what people say, his story, the victor's story. And we're living right now in a time where a lot of that is being uncovered. And we just need to keep standing in solidarity with indigenous people in Latin America, with indigenous people in Australia, here, all over, and continue to show their culture and acknowledge their culture, respect their culture, to get to put an end to this colonialization that is so rapid in this world. And if we can do that, we can definitely have liberation, honestly. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Rodrigo, for coming on. This was a pleasure, and we'd love to have you on another time. Thank you so much for taking your time to be on this show.
Thank you very much, Jamal, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Indigenous, gotta holler if you really feeling this. Gotta holler if you really real enough. Other rappers is delirious. Yeah, it's really that serious. Better holler if you really feeling me. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna live in abundance. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna. I gotta keep it 100. We gotta stop all the stunting. You know we coming from nothing. Yo, you talking about money, you bluffing. We gotta do something different. We gotta change how we live in. We gotta do better for women. We gotta do better for children. We gotta listen to victims, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian. It doesn't matter your religion. You gotta stand against the system, or else you just another villain. How you just sitting there